Hello everybody, looks like we are on. We're working with the ocean today, working with this cresting wave. If you are new to this series, I'm Scott. This is Drawing Together and we are with Artist Network. We meet every Monday, Wednesday to get together and draw. Today the subject is this wave. You can see the reference image right below here, and then in the description you'll find a link to that reference image. You can bring that up, and you can also find links to Artist Network where you can join the community there, share your work. There were some wonderful drawings of the portrait that we did on Monday. A lot of you have been posting there, so that has been amazing to see that work. So nicely done. Challenging subject. Today, this wave is it's a bit of a challenge. I'm a little intimidated by this today, but I think hopefully we're going to have a little bit of fun. In this preparatory one that I've done, I worked on the rag paper using charcoal. So I've got my charcoal pencils, got my shading stumps, I've got my rubber eraser and my kneaded eraser handy, and that's what I used to create this initial study. And one of the things I like about the rag paper is that there's kind of a grainy quality to it. It's just a really unique tooth compared to some other charcoal papers. But what I found in this is that it didn't quite give me what I was looking for in terms of the texture. In very subtle ways, I feel like overall it helped. I created a solid study of this, but it's not quite what I was going for. So what I've decided to do here is work on the smoother paper, that one that I've been using for quite a while now. I've cut it down to about 14, I think by about 8.5, to create a bit of a lost my eraser, a bit of more of a horizontal kind of look at this scene. So the reference image that you have, I believe, is sized for about an 8.5 by 11. But I've chosen to crop this down, and I feel like that. I guess I did that for just kind of aesthetic purposes. As I was looking at what was happening in the reference image below here, and at the top, I felt like that information there wasn't anything critical. And by elongating the composition, it helps to kind of accentuate the movement of the ocean. So that's kind of what I was thinking about. In general, when I think about composition, that's what I'm looking for, is what's happening in the subject and how can I use the dimensions of the paper to reinforce what's happening in the subject. In this case, there's that horizontal pull of the wave, and I felt like by cropping the top and bottom a bit more and accentuating the horizontal nature, it's going to help to create that. So we'll see how that plays out in this. So again, we're going to get started here. I'm going to try to do my best to monitor the thread. Let's see, I'm not able to connect with the chat for some reason. Let me just do a little bit of a reset. Just getting this error message that I'm not unable to connect to the chat, in that that's no fun. I like to see what you all have going on. So now we're back. So if you do have any questions throughout, please feel free to call them out in all caps. So Jenna, I see your question here. How do you clean your erasers? Let's see, I have, actually, let me show you my kneaded eraser. So this is going to be the first drawing I've done live using my new kneaded eraser. This has been the old one I've been using for all 37 episodes of the season, and this will still work. It's starting to dry out. It's starting to get loaded with charcoal. This new one, this new kneaded eraser, is just cleaner, brighter. So with a kneaded eraser, it's just simply stretching and pulling to access more of that clean eraser. Now with the rubber eraser, you can see that it's picking up some charcoal from previous drawings as well. And so I can use my kneaded eraser to kind of pick that up. I can also sand this down on sandpaper, or just through the act of drawing, it will start to kind of file down to that clean area. So if it's too dirty for you, I would simply try to get as much off as you can with a kneaded eraser. Sometimes just using your thumb or your finger can be enough to kind of rub that off, but that's how I would do it. And if you really can't get it off, then just take some sandpaper and kind of sand it down that way. It's just a fine grit will do well for you. Let's see. Other questions? Expect me to draw this. I hope you will draw this all. If not, again, this whole series is about trying to push ourselves farther. So I'm trying to choose subjects that will help me to become a better drawer and a better painter, and in hopes that by sharing this out, we all work on this together, we're developing skills that will continually advance our skills. So there's a likelihood that this will all fall apart on the page, and I hope not, but that's part of what we're here to do. This isn't about demonstrating mastery as much as demonstrating the practice of it all and hopefully improving our skills. So what I want to do right now, that top crest of the wave, there's a line that runs across there that's really kind of the thrust of the drawing. So I'm just using my shading stump, one of my older ones that has quite a bit of charcoal loaded onto it, and I'm creating some very light lines to help orient myself. And I want to keep that broken. And there's a basic value structure in this wave such that it's darker here, lighter in the middle, gradually getting darker down in here. What I found in the initial stab at this drawing was that, ultimately what this is about understanding movement and trying to capture that, trying to capture the gesture. So we have this photograph that has frozen this wave in time, and I think we could try to replicate that again, that frozen moment. But ideally, how I could use this in my own practice is when I'm on location. If I was at the ocean right now, how would I be approaching this? I would have to be studying the general patterns of a wave as they crash and try to capture that, rather than one individual wave frozen in time, trying to capture the structure of waves more in general, looking at the color, looking at the basic shapes, etc. So I'm trying to put myself in that mindset of preparing myself for painting on location. Now, I live in Colorado, so I don't have an opportunity very often to paint cresting waves. Growing up in Maine, this is something that it would have been more easy for me to achieve. It was just closer to the ocean, and they were part of life there. But in this case, it's going to be all about again, trying to put myself in the moment of being there, and evaluating as I go, how precise do I need to be. So what I'm doing at this moment, as you can see, is I had the kind of rough target for that division of light and dark, and I'm gradually building up layers of vine charcoal. My hand's already getting loaded up. If you're using graphite right now, then what you might do is try to use the side of the pencil and again build up very soft layers. I'm using the vine charcoal on its side because I don't want to be thinking about lines at this point. I want to be trying to think about broader areas of value, and starting to think about movement. So as I'm working in this area up here, there's an undulation of the wave. There's this movement this way. And then, of course, each larger swell is broken by smaller wave forms. But I want to be able to see that general larger kind of swell first, squinting my eyes to see the areas of light and dark, and then we're going to go back in and add more detail later. One of the things that's also going to be critical in this is drawing positive and negative space. That's something that we've been doing a lot throughout this whole series, is thinking about positive and negative space. But in this case in particular, we've got this white sea foam that's all going to be kind of negative space drawn in on top. And so we want to be thinking back and forth between positive and negative space. I see a bunch of questions coming in, so I want to pause for a second and look to make sure I'm not missing anything critical. Let's see. Sharon, you're going to pull out your pastels. That's fantastic, saying that it's not working for you with the graphite. So yeah, let's see how we go with pastels in this one. Judy, it looks like you might be having some difficulty here. Hopefully it's working for everybody. And then Karen, you're asking about the vine charcoal. So I'm utilizing primarily, the width of the vine charcoal, and it's kind of filing it down along in here. You can see it is sanded to a point. As I rotate and I roll that charcoal up, I can engage the point a little bit more. But I'm trying to utilize the side of it a bit more. And it's just building up in fine layers. If you notice that early on, as I was making my first pass with the vine charcoal, it's leaving this texture of the surface underneath. So what's underneath it right now is actually a sheet of crescent mat board that I found. It's relatively smooth, but it has a bit of a tooth to it, and that's showing through the paper. I'm trying to squint to see the general shapes and the general pattern of light and dark. And as you may have noticed already, the vine charcoal is very soft. It's very kind of ephemeral, and that's okay. I'm kind of trying to orient myself more than anything, and thinking gesturally about the way the waves are forming. Now this area in here where we can see a bit of the sea foam, that's going to be really tricky. This is, to me, the part that really caught me in that initial attempt. And I'm going to dig into that a little bit more, but what you see if you look at that area is you see an alternating pattern of light and dark from that sea foam to that aquamarine. We also see a transition in light, in light and shadow. So we see a shadow form that's being cast by this wave here. There's light here, and then within that shadow there's also some reflected light, and all of that's throwing things off in terms of value control. So I need to look really carefully at what's happening in those values, and to me that's going to be essential in establishing that form. So much of what is essential for capturing the structure of a wave is reliant on our ability to perceive the shape of the light and the shadow. And it can be really hard because these are such, ambiguous forms in some way. And so if we can try to see the large form of that wave, it's going to help us in the end. So really understand that there's this upward thrust, and then this more gentle slope here, and then the kind of the cresting over of that. And if we can try to kind of see that in the reference photo, there are patches of light and shadow in there. But again, it becomes challenging to view because there are also variations in value caused by the bounce light in those shadows, caused by the sea foam on there as well. So there's a lot going on. So right now what I'm doing as I'm working down here, I'm also seeing that change in perspective. So as we start to see the rocks here, the water is thin, there are these kind of thinner slivers of marks as we rake across that perspective, and then we hit the wave and it starts to come up against that wall here. And so I'm trying to change my marks in a gestural way to respond to what's happening in the structure. So I'm using the side of the charcoal, but I'm creating these lines here. So it's somewhat linear, but I'm still utilizing the side of the pencil, so then I can quickly shift to larger shapes. And part of what I feel like is important in this subject matter, and why I found it more valuable than I expected. To me, I thought this was going to be an interesting subject, And as I was doing that initial drawing, though, I realized, wow, there's a lot to this that I can apply to other subjects. And one of the big things is just trusting your marks and allowing the material itself to create a sense of texture and kind of go with it, rather than really trying to fight to control your material. Allow things to happen on the page and evaluate them to see, how can that be useful to me in understanding the wave. As you can see, now I have my kneaded eraser, and I'm starting to kind of erase out some of the structure of the wave. But I want to keep things broken. There's a strong edge along here, but if you follow along that edge, at each point there's a constant shift in contrast between the wave here and those background waves. Whether there's a change in value, or the edge, the quality of that edge is constantly changing. So what I want to do is I want to start to see and hear some of the shapes of light. If this is a big solid form, where would that light be hitting? And I come over here, there's a big shape of light here. This is largely in light. But then we go into shadow against this area here. So positive and negative drawing. So if you're new to that term, positive space is anything that is the object. Negative space is everything that's around that object. But it can be tricky in a subject like this, because if we look over here, for example, we see these light highlights of that sea foam, and we can start to create that by drawing some of that space around it, which is also wave. And so there's multiple layers of positive and negative space. So within this form, even though it's all part of one form, the wave, there's a positive element and a negative element. And then there's a positive and negative element between the major wave here and those background waves. But I think what's important is that when you're able to identify, like right now, I'm drawing these background waves here with the intent that it's going to define the wave in front of it, if that makes sense. So that's, again, a big part of drawing, is that we sometimes sneak up on a subject. We may be actually drawing one thing in order to render another. So drawing that background wave in such a way that it brings that foreground wave forward. All right. Looks like everybody is on. I know there were some initial troubles with the internet connection. I had to restart things a little bit especially when I reset things with the chat. For some reason, my live chat was frozen, so I had to reload the page, and that may have caused a disruption temporarily. But I feel like already right now we can start to see the presence of a wave, even though it's all very loose and sketchy. If somebody were to walk into the room right now and look at this, they could say, hey, that kind of reminds me of a wave, and that would be a good thing. Again, that's generally been my approach, and one of the things that I've been trying to demonstrate in this series is the idea that in drawing you can kind of bring up everything together. And then you, as the artist, are in control of how much detail you want to add. And one of the things that's also really, really powerful about this subject is that constantly changing texture. So I'm over here and I'm seeing these kind of more smooth, glass-like forms, and really kind of unique ripples. As we come across here, it starts to get more diffused. And you see that sea foam that's pulling through in this area, and then the waves back here are a different structure as well. So let's really try to focus on texture for this one. And then on the back side of this wave, it looks like we're seeing some glassy, kind of smoother surface of the rocks just below the surface that are exposed in the bottom swell of the wave. So, all right, so if you do have any questions throughout the event, feel free to type them out in all caps. I'm not seeing any right now. But what I'm looking for right now is to make sure that I have the basic structure down. If I squint, I can see more of a shadow right in here, and I'm trying to see that general shape. Utilizing the side of the pencil, and then just the natural tooth of the paper helps to suggest the texture, especially of the spray in some of these areas. And that may be tricky. I know when teaching drawing, sometimes I would get beginning students in who really have a hard time breaking away from the idea that every mark needs to be made with a sharp point. Because we're used to holding a pencil to write, and that's all generally created with a rather sharp point. And so if you're struggling with that, really try to force yourself to hold the materials in a new way. So I've got this overhand grip that allows me to just kind of skip the charcoal across the surface of the paper. All right, let me see. I think now at this point we can kind of move into that background. Now the vine charcoal is very soft, very light. Some of it's sticking, but for the most part it's just going to come off the page. The size of the paper pagne, it's about 8.5 by 14 is what I had, and then I had the tape coming in about 1/4 of an inch. So those are the dimensions that I worked with. So now I'm going to work with just this charcoal pencil, and I've sharpened this one to a point. You may have seen me work with my pencils sharpened like this, where I just kind of carve away using a razor blade. But for this, we get these strong kind of diamond shape, not patterns, but textures in the water, and actually a sharp pencil holding it on its side like this will help me to kind of achieve those marks. And so I'm trying to bring about these darker areas of the wave utilizing the side of the pencil, and I can create finer lines by kind of sliding along the length of the charcoal and more broad marks at the same time. And it kind of lends itself to this diamond form. So if I rotate it a little bit, I can create the marks that I need for this. So similar to how we attacked the strawberry, one of the things we learned in the strawberry is that with so much detail in there, it can be overwhelming, and we can often lose our place. And so in this case, we may be working in this section, and then I look up at the reference photo, and it may take me a little while to orient myself. What is most critical is to look at the kind of marks that are present in that region of the paper. So along here, for example, the marks really kind of thin out, and they become smoother, longer. And so even if I don't get those marks exactly right, if I incorporate some of that gesture in the basic types of shapes that I'm seeing, it'll read more like the type of water that we're looking at, if that makes sense. So rather than getting bogged down and making each and every kind of wave identical to the photo, let's try to capture the general flow of it by looking at the shapes that we're seeing in that region. So here the wave starts to crest up, and those shapes start to open up, and they become kind of more diamond shape. And I notice that they're a bit sharper at the top of each edge and then kind of fade out towards the bottom. Yeah, so with this pencil, I've actually used an electric pencil sharpener to erase this one. In general, though, with this one, I use a razor blade when I sharpen it like this. So as you can see, we're starting to create a little bit of contrast, but with that layer of vine charcoal underneath it, when I add the compressed charcoal on top, it creates this really nice contrast, and that gray initially becomes more, that initial gray becomes kind of a lighter, kind of a highlight there. Welcome anybody who's new. I'm hoping that the internet issues aren't bad today. Everything seems to be connected well on my end. I'm not getting any sort of error message. But if you do have any trouble with it, this goes up as a recording afterwards. And so you can kind of check back in a little bit later. So here what I'm seeing is a bit more contrast on this edge. So what I'm trying to look for these larger shapes in here, and I'm trying to, in general, express the basic shapes and sizes of the marks in this region. And I know I'm off a little bit from the photo, but I feel like it's still capturing the wave pretty well. So a lot of just suggestion. This is where you start to feel like a magician in some ways, where you're allowing the materials to kind of do its thing, and next thing you know, our brain interprets it as a wave or as a reflection. It's amazing how that can happen sometimes. And you know, if you get the gesture of the marks right, it's amazing what information gets translated through that. Now, as we move across back in here, the marks get smaller. You know, the waves back here are much farther away than this wave here, and as a result, those marks are getting smaller, kind of closer together, and I'm not seeing as defined of a swell back there. There's more kind of a general texture, and so I can kind of be loose with this and just using the side of the pencil, letting it skip across the surface can suggest texture. And back here there's a more defined swell, so I can kind of fill that in a little bit. But a lot of what's happening is trying to, again, latch onto the general shape in that area and allow my hand to kind of simply react to it. And if you're having a hard time with that, you know, then this is where the practice comes in, of trying to synchronize, trying to develop hand-eye coordination. And that's what drawing is really effective at developing. You know, so I'm doing this again because I'm interested in improving my painting skills, and one of the ways that drawing helps with that is improving my hand-eye coordination. I can react to the forms more quickly. And I'm looking for general areas of value. It gets a little bit darker right in here, which is going to be great because then it's going to create that additional contrast against the wave in front of it. And one of the things I need to ask myself is, how much detail do I need to put in this section that I'm working on now? Because I want this wave to ultimately be the focal point. If I do too little detail, it becomes a distraction. If I do too much detail, it can become a distraction. And you yourself are going to define that in your own work. But it's something to kind of consider. We can sometimes make the assumption that you just add detail everywhere. And I did that for a long time in my work. And I'm not sure that it really helped me when I was doing that. So I'm trying to learn to become more selective in where I apply that detail. If you get the values right and you get the general forms right, you can convey a lot of information without adding much detail. So this is a lot about suggestion. If you have any questions, you know, about the general technique, just feel free to call them out. So I'm seeing Sue, your question about with a pastel pencil. Yeah, I believe so. I work with soft pastel sticks, very much in the same way. You know, because you can't really get a sharp point with a pastel stick, and so. And I really love that experience of when the materials almost kind of do their own thing. You're just letting it kind of skip across the surface of the paper, and when you're just kind of reacting to it and allowing the materials to just kind of synchronize with your thoughts. The way I like to think about it is similarly to a seismograph. You know, a seismograph takes kind of the vibration of the earth, translates it through a small needle, and onto a piece of paper where it leaves its mark. And I like to think about that as well as, we're taking in this visual information and we're translating that into an electrical signal that our brain then interprets. and we allow that to kind of travel down our arm into the fine point of the material. And so sometimes I like to just try to let go of thinking and just simply react to the materials. All right. I'm probably going to continue to work in here, but I want to make sure that before I finish that everything is looking good down in here. What I might do is, I really love the shape of this crest in here, so do some negative drawing. And rather than drawing a line per se, I'm trying to visualize what that path is, place my pencil on that path, and then draw away from the crest of the wave. And in that way, I'm creating a shape without there being a solid line. And I may use solid lines later on to kind of draw more attention to a particular area. But right now, I want to try to eliminate an outline. I think it's going to add to that sense of movement, trying to get rid of any sort of outlines here. So this is very much a lot, negative drawing in here. So I'm looking, I have this reference image projected up here on my left. And this gets tricky in here with that sea foam kind of spray up there. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to look at the space between all the marks. And be careful of creating a rhythm in here. I've talked about that before in other subjects as well, is there's a natural tendency for us to want to make perfectly even, consistent marks, even if it's not conscious. Like we'll find ourselves making all of our marks consistent and even. It's just it can be a very powerful kind of subconscious desire, and I often find that I have to fight myself from doing that, because I build up this natural rhythm where I'm kind of making marks and just kind of ticking in a rhythmic way, and then it starts to feel less than natural. So that's just kind of sharpening up that edge along there. How do you think about these textures when you paint, especially when you're introducing color? That's what Anita is asking. So when painting is very similar. Drawing is about the relationship between your materials, charcoal, graphite, whatever, and the paper itself. Painting is in a relationship between the color, the pigment in the paint, your brush, and the surface. So if you're working on linen or canvas or a panel, it's all about that dynamic between them. And so understanding how the surface catches the paint can be really helpful there. And so this is, when I'm working here, one of the things that my hand is being sensitive to is that it's the resistance of the paper on the material. And it's one of the things that I find challenging to work on digitally on a tablet, for example. That resistance disappears, and I'm not quite sure. It doesn't allow me to create the texture that I want. The texture is controlled in a different way, and so a lot of what's happening is just it's about the material, the charcoal or the paint, skipping across the surface and seeing how it works there. And then when you're dealing with color, you can start to layer it. So you can really push in a layer, thin layer underneath that kind of soaks into that texture, and then you can layer kind of scumble a color on top that allows some of that color underneath to show through. And now in this case, I'm just thinking about black and white, but I'm seeing the texture. Part of the texture is being achieved by allowing some of the white of the paper to show through, where the charcoal can't get into those little crevices. That's where this tool comes in. This is my shading stump. And I'm going to kind of now work through and not just kind of smooth out the texture, but kind of refine the texture a little bit more. So this has a very similar shape to the pencil. It's got the potential to create these kind of diamond-like forms. And so now I'm essentially taking another stab at creating the texture of the waves using this shading stump. Now you're always contributing to the form, and that's something that I've mentioned before. So if you're new to the series, you may not have heard this, but whatever material you have, it's always an opportunity to refine the form. So even though this is a shading stump or a blending stump, it's not just about smoothing things out. It's an opportunity to create a unique mark that reflects your understanding of the subject. So I want to continue to look. It's sometimes I've seen students that almost use this tool as a way to feel like they can escape looking, because now they're like, all right, I've done my looking, now I'm just kind of smoothing things out. Like, no, this is another opportunity to continue to look and perhaps see something more deeply. So I'm seeing another kind of layer of texture that can be achieved in here. Again, I'm looking at the shape of the marks that happen in this portion of the wave as it crests upward, as it swells upwards. And in general, like I said, these marks, these darker areas I observe in the reference photo tend to be kind of sharper at the top, and then they kind of soften out towards the bottom. So hopefully those comments make sense about kind of applying this to painting as well. And a lot of what happens in drawing and painting, and I've talked a bit about this before, is that there's a back and forth that happens. Many times we'll think of drawing or painting as being purely additive. You're starting with a white piece of paper, you're adding charcoal, you're adding graphite to it. But I find it more helpful for me, and this is a very painterly way, to think about it being both additive and subtractive. You continually work the material, and because I'm drawing to become a better painter right now, this is very much an approach that I would use in my painting. You're kind of layering things, you're making marks, you're moving them around, you're adding, you're subtracting, you're scraping, you're trying all sorts of things to try to achieve the effect. And so one of the areas where I try to work with students on is to give it more time. Rather than feeling like it's a very linear execution, starting from nothing, drawing an outline, building it up, adding to the details. It doesn't always play out that way. You may work on an area, erase it down, do it again, then try it with a different material, and continue to work on it. And I see what a lot of students almost kind of give up too early, or they get to the point of finish too early. So that's another way that this relates to painting. And so I might lay down a color here, and if it's not right, do it again. Lay down another color, build another color on top, and maybe the initial color works well as an under layer to create some optical mixing. But a lot of it's just kind of reacting as you go. And as I've mentioned before as well, is that every drawing goes through an ugly duckling stage, where you feel like it's just all going to fall apart, and you're like, well, this does not look good. And if you've seen some of my portrait videos, you'll have seen me go through that, where you're like, oh my God, that's really, that's going to come together? And that's part of what I love about drawing and painting process, is that point at which you feel like everything is just kind of teetering on the edge and could just crumble apart, and you continue to work on it and you fight through it, and it comes out the way you want it. Sometimes things just go too far and you realize that you're never going to be able to really reclaim it. But then I always try to tell myself, how can I reclaim the experience? So maybe the painting doesn't work out, but if it doesn't look the way I want it to, I can still walk away with something positive. I can maybe learn something about how the materials work or how color works, or maybe maybe the whole drawing itself is junk, but there's like one part in it where I got a technique or I got a mark that was really fascinating, or taught me something about drawing. All right, so if you're looking for technique instruction, again, I work for Artist Network. We have lots of videos on techniques in all different media. And for me, teaching art is it's a balance between teaching techniques as well as mindset and the subject and all of those things, and we all have a kind of a different take on that. All right, so I'm feeling better about this background here, and hopefully that gives you a sense that it can be intimidating looking at this and looking at all those individual waves and feeling like you need to render each wave, and you don't. You can carry so much information by simply reacting to it and being gestural with your marks, and kind of trusting that. Judy's saying, heard something recently, practice makes progress rather than perfect. That's exactly right. Last thing that I would want is to get to the point in my art where I feel like I've done it all. There's so much of what continues to propel me is the idea that there's going to be something in the next painting that's going to teach me something either about painting or about the world or just about that experience. It's continual practice. All right, so now I'm working up into this wave, and now I need to shift my thinking from what I was doing here in the background to what I'm doing here. It's a different wave. They're different marks. It's a different scale. It's in a different place. And I need to observe how those marks are different than what's behind there. So we go from these more angular marks back in here to these marks here where they're more smooth, they're longer, they kind of curl up and around. I've got a lot of charcoal loaded on this, so I'm going to continue to use this shading stump now as a kind of a rendering tool. And I'm looking for that, again, that negative drawing. I'm starting to see that foam here on the top. I'm trying to visualize that path and then build up to that. And I'm rolling that shading stump in my fingers to get to a new spot. Now there's some texture from that initial layer of vine charcoal that's not working for me. And so what do I need to do? Actually, that's a fairly dark area in value, so what I need to do is kind of fill in the areas between those dark spots. And I'm going to do that with, I guess I'll do that with the vine charcoal. It's a little bit softer. So I'm just looking at the lighter spots between some of those blotches and lightly filling it in. And as a result, what I'm hoping for is that it'll be a bit smoother. I'm looking at the structure. It gets lighter up here, and then as we come down across here, it starts to get darker again. So one of the things that it's been a while since I've really kind of articulated is the idea that marks are thoughts, right? And we talked a bit about that with the analogy of the seismograph, and every mark we make starts as a thought in our mind, whether we're conscious of that thought or not. And as you build your hand-eye coordination and you build your confidence in yourself, as you start to trust that hand-eye coordination, you get to the point where you can observe what's happening in front of you and hold that in your mind, and your brain will do the rest. It's like it'll be translated by your mind into your hand onto the page, without you thinking how to do that. And so that's why practicing drawing can be so important, because drawing, it is a way to make an image, but for me it's more valuable as a tool to process information about your world. And the more you do that, and the more you just work with the materials, the easier it'll be for you to, again, put your attention on what's in front of you and less about how to actually make it happen. It's just like learning an instrument where, initially if you're learning a piano or guitar or something like that, you're focusing so much on each and every note, and then eventually it becomes second nature, and you can think about the melody, you can think about the rhythm all in that, and it all gets translated subconsciously onto the page. But that comes through practice, and deliberately kind of learning about the materials and just getting comfortable with it. The more conscious you can be about your practice, I believe the more quickly you get to that point of where you no longer need consciousness to really think about it. So, all right, so as you can see, I'm changing the quality of the marks here, really trying to smooth this out on this wave, and then I'll add a little bit of detail and kind of texture as we go through it. I'm kind of working my way across, and I'm trying to be conscious of this white crest of the wave, and it gets really difficult to see in some of the areas. So then the question is do I invent something that I can't really see, or do I go with my observation? So right in this area, it's all very subtle, and I think I'm going to let that be subtle as well. As another good saying, teaching psychology, we say practice makes permanent. That's right. Yeah, we kind of internalize all of these things. Our brains are designed to find patterns and routines, establish what is known in the mind. So the more you do something, the more familiar it is with your brain. It's almost like you're just giving the brain opportunities, and you kind of let it do its thing, rather than try to control it. Okay, so I'm getting kind of bogged down in the weeds there. What I need to do is move across here. And one of the things I'm trying to be mindful of is where are the highlights on the wave. So right in here, there's this kind of triangular shape that I can leave, and I can kind of smudge out this area. There's a bit of a highlight in this area. So I'm just using the charcoal that's on my finger now to kind of create that, and it keeps me from getting bogged down. And then there's this somewhat triangular shape of light in here that I want to capture, and then as we roll up here, this is all slightly darker in value than that highlight. I need to isolate that, so I'm just kind of smudging that. Excellent, and getting some good feedback. Hopefully this is helping. This is, again, just my take on it, but what I love about drawing together is that you all share your thoughts with me, and it's been really invaluable having you point out areas for improvement, particularly in the portraits. As I say, I'm less adept at them, but I'm feeling a lot more confident about them now than I was before. And a lot of that comes from you all providing your observations as I go through it and say, hey, check out the angle in the chin or the distance between the nose and the upper lip, things like that. So if you're seeing something, if we're reacting to something, I'd love to hear what that is. Taking feedback from others is a very important aspect of improving your skills as an artist. So being able to provide feedback and accept it is an important skill. I know when I first started, it was very difficult for me to receive constructive criticism. I saw myself as failing And over time, I've come to realize that that really only held me back. And now I welcome feedback much more readily. Not all the time. I've worked on a painting that I'm, proud of, and I feel like I've really hit the nail on the head. Then I'll show it to somebody, and they'll provide an opportunity for my ego to grapple with itself. And I want to hear is that's a great painting, but I know in my heart it isn't, right? And it's when you find somebody that can give you that feedback and you can accept it, that's really valuable. So kind of pay attention to who in your circle gives you the feedback that you need. So what's happening now is that I've got this vine charcoal stick and I'm making marks and it's not doing anything. So sometimes that happens with vine charcoal. You hit like a little knot in the wood and it just doesn't do anything. So if you just roll it, find a fresh spot, it'll help. So that's what was happening. I kept going to try to make it a mark and it's not doing anything. All right, so again, reacting to the flow of the water, seeing the undulations, seeing the different pull, rather than trying to be bogged down by rendering something specific, trying to keep it more gestural. There's a bit of a kind of a rocking motion that happens in there, where if I exaggerate it, I'm kind of lifting up, dropping down, lifting up on the backstroke. And so then it creates these kind of tapered marks, and that's part of really kind of locking on to the pressure, paying attention to the pressure with which you're applying the materials. And so as I go through here, there's subtle variations in value. It's a little bit darker right up in here. I lose that edge. Come down here and it gets darker again, because then there's some reflected light happening in here where the light from this is reflecting off of the wave down in here, but it gets a little bit darker. So I'm trying to observe that. And as you can see, I'm not drawing any of that sea foam yet. That's going to give me the trouble. I'm going to really kind of hunker down on that spot, but I want to kind of establish everything else first, because what can happen is if I focus on texture too early before I really understand the form, all that texture pops to the surface and just flattens out the whole drawing. So I want to be really careful before I get into that, and I think that's going to be kind of an important area. So let's see. Again, I'm hitting that knot in the wood and it's not making a mark, but it kind of serves me well because then I can take a couple practice stabs, try to get a sense for where that mark is going to be, and just roll that pencil to find something, or the charcoal to find a fresh spot there. Okay, going to move back to the shading stump. Adding some of the lines in here. Really trying to observe how that wave kind of curls up and then over. Follow along that cross contour. And that feels pretty good. It's not a solid form, but it suggests some of that reflected light there in that texture. Shirley's asking if I like to use vine charcoal sticks more than the blocks. I do. I really only utilize the blocks when I need a really dark value. That's to me where their strength is it gets so much darker than any of the materials I have here. Now in this case, that's not going to necessarily benefit me to have really dark values. But I think I like to kind of sneak up on the forms a little bit, and the compressed charcoal stick block can sometimes just be too blunt. It just goes right to that dark value quickly. So if anything, I kind of bring it in towards the end. And then we have this kind of cresting wave. So I'm just going to try to suggest that form. And I want to be mindful not to create too consistent of a mark, right? I don't want there to be kind of evenly spaced lines in here. All right, so then as we get this spray here, I don't want to smooth that out too much. I kind of want to use the tooth of the paper to simulate that spray, and then it smooths out up into this area. So that the mind, the eye, I have a hard time separating the mind from the eye. It's all one system, but it's really good at perceiving the direction of marks very subtly. So right in here, even though we may not be conscious of it at first, we see that contrast between these vertical marks here and these lower, slower, slanting marks over here. And then we piece that together and it reinforces that form. So that's why paying attention to the direction of your marks can be really helpful, because you know, I've seen some great drawings where you get the values right, everything is right, but the marks are running in the wrong direction and it works against the form that you're trying to create. So just something to kind of think about if you're not really at the point where it's creating a lot of form for you. Try to study the direction of your marks. So as I come up here, I want to be thinking about this pull right up in this area. And actually there's an interesting kind of wave. So the kneaded eraser is a wonderful tool to create these kind of irregular eraser marks, break up some of that form. So I'm just kind of tapping, reshaping, tapping, so I don't want to end up with kind of a stamping of that same shape over and over again in, you know, throughout the drawing. But it can be a great way to now kind of switch that thinking. So whereas drawing the blue up to the crest of the wave, now I can think more in a positive shape way to create that sea spray there. I really like there's a line right in here that becomes more sharp, and I really like that. So I want to kind of accentuate that a little bit. I feel like that's important to provide that texture. So as we follow along, that edge is constantly variating and or varying. I don't know. Varying is it's not a word, I don't think. But it's constantly varying, and that's what gives it life and form. And if I need to, I can come back in with my charcoal pencil, find that line, and start to kind of lightly bring in some value there to define that edge. This is my favorite way of holding the pencil, kind of more like this, like a chopstick, so that I can engage the side of the pencil. Welcome, Suzanne. First time watching, welcome. Don't worry, this goes up as a recording when it's all done. If you are new, I encourage you to check out some of the others. They're not necessarily linearly constructed. You know, there's no kind of curriculum path that I'm following here. You know, we're on episode 38, I believe. And so find the subject that works for you. And what we're trying to do here is, you know, find challenging subjects that will help build our drawing skills. You know, so with each subject we kind of learn something new. On a Monday, we'll be heading back to portraiture, focusing on drawing a smile. And I started working on that already. It's going to be a tough one. Holy smokes. I definitely need to practice that before I bring this to you guys so that I can articulate what's happening on it a little bit more easily. But that's kind of the idea, is that we're all here just to kind of try out new things, try to get better. All right, so One of my philosophies, again, if you're new, you wouldn't have heard me say this. One of my philosophies is you want to strike and move. Like you want to keep moving through the drawing and not get bogged down in detail in one area. So I need to do that. I need to practice that. So right in here, we see a transition from a shadow that's being cast by this wave, and then this part of the wave catches the light again. It's almost like this bowl that kind of strikes in under there. That white sea foam passes between those two areas. It goes from the light to that shadow side. And that's going to be really tricky. And so what I want to do now, what I think the approach is I've kind of lightly drawn in that shadow. But now what I want to do is try to lightly draw in that blue part of the wave using some negative drawing to show the sea foam. So I'm trying to keep my marks fairly irregular, but I'm thinking about it in a positive and negative way. And I'm crossing over that line between the light and shadow here. So I'm not separating, I'm not drawing the light side and then the shadow area. I'm crossing over them now, and then I'm going to try to layer that shadow in on top. And my hope is that it'll help to unify that and make it feel like that sea foam is consistent across there. So I'm squinting because I don't want to get bogged down in the details, because it's not critical that I get every shape right. What I want to do is, like I said earlier in this stage here, is look at the shapes in that region and try to replicate that type of shape. So where does it get thinner? Where does it become more open? So right in here, for example, we're kind of shearing across this portion of the wave, and those marks get a little bit thinner. And then as we come down here, we roll down into another part of the wave where those marks get a little bit bigger. So again, I'm doing some negative drawing. I want to try to create the look of that sea foam by drawing the shapes between them. And then we come back out here into light again. So I'm just going to continue that. Move across. And now as we come down here, we're really shearing across the plane of that water. And as a result, all those marks kind of squish. And so we're kind of moving across the plane, and then we kind of come up a wall where those marks open up. And so let's try to let these gestural marks kind of reflect that. And then that sea foam starts to kind of disappear over here. There's just less of those longer lines. Some of that texture of the paper is showing through, and I kind of like the way that's working. So I may not blend that out, but I may blend in some other areas. So again, try to observe what's happening on the plane at each part of the wave. And I'm just utilizing the side of the pencil because I want to be thinking in terms of shape, not line, as much as possible. And so hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, Annette, you're saying sneaking up on the darks just like in watercolor. That's generally the case. You may be blocking in the shapes of the light and shadow, but building towards those darks. One of the advantages to drawing, though, is that I have the ability to kind of erase back out those lights, which becomes much more challenging in watercolor. But especially when going for realism, we're trying to get rid of the outlines as much as possible. So hopefully that starts to suggest that play between, that blue sea, the ocean there, and then some of the that sea foam on top. Kind of just using this shading stump to refine some of these marks a little bit. I don't know if you can hear it, but there's generally just kind of this tapping that happens in the drawing. kind of skipping across the page, tapping on it more than really drawing. That's what allows you to kind of embrace the texture of it. Okay, so now that I've got that, kind of soften this out, I need to reestablish that shadow. So what I'm going to do is essentially apply a wash. So another analogy with watercolor, with charcoal, you can achieve a similar effect. I want to darken this area in here where that shadow is. And so I'm just going to kind of lightly wash over this whole area and bring everything in this area down in value, but then hopefully it maintains that structure. That structure that we're going for there. So now we have a little bit more contrast, and I can increase that, if I need to, by using my kneaded eraser to pull out some of the lights in this area, in the light area, or sea foam. And then that creates that transparency of light and dark. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the drawing process, is that, when you move away from the idea of kind of finishing as you go, then you realize that you end up drawing this wave many, many times. Initially I used the vine charcoal, and then I started to add a little bit more vine charcoal to it. Then I used the compressed charcoal to draw on some of the shapes, and I added the wash, and then I can erase out some of these forms. And so each time I'm doing that, I'm confronting the structure of the wave and learning more about it. And so you end up drawing that wave multiple times, and each time you do, you're just going to get better and better. But if I had finished as I went, then really I'm only drawing that wave one time, and if I'm off, then I'm kind of stuck. So you're kind of sneaking up on it, not just in terms of the drawing process, but in the thinking process. Each time you're going through, you're trying to learn something more about the wave and the structure, the marks that you're seeing in front of you. With this kneaded eraser, I'm just trying to be very light with it so that it doesn't pull up too much of the material, and it kind of blends it a little bit. So it's just the weight of the kneaded eraser on that page, and that starts to suggest some of that reflected light in here. So in that shadow area, that light here is kind of bouncing off in the waves there in that shadow. And I want to, if I pull up too much in this area, then it'll no longer read as being in a shadow. So that's why I have to be really sensitive to it. So I'm just, again, it's just the weight of the eraser on that, in this area. So it's pulling up some of that light to suggest that's reflected light while keeping it still in that shadow. If I were painting right now, then I'd be looking for that change in color as well between the lights there and the lights in the shadow. All right, so I'm just kind of adding a little bit more detail here, kind of working my way into the crest of the waves. So, and if I build up the structure here, then it eases some of the burden in trying to render that area over there. So, I'm sorry that it keeps freezing for you. It might be glitching a little bit here. OBB, you notice that your session drawing is always better than the prep. Exactly. That's why I do it before I do this. I think the biggest thing for me is that I'll pick a subject that I find interesting, and I may think that I know what it's going to be about, but I found over time that once I get into it, those assumptions get challenged, and it may be about something completely different, and I think it's really helpful then to give me some time to figure out how to articulate that. I kind of found that with this as well, is that there's so much more to it than I anticipated there would be. And I think it's helpful to do that preparatory sketch because I want it to be as valuable for you all as possible. What I'm doing back in here is I'm kind of giving myself a break as I've been focusing on this area, and I need to come back to this area with fresh eyes. So I'm going to go back up in here where it's largely established, and I'm kind of just picking away. I'm kind of clearing my head a little bit. And I think that's important in your own drawing process, is to kind of pay attention to how your brain is processing those thoughts, give it some time, and you know, give yourself a break now and then. It's good to come back with fresh eyes. If you're following along and you haven't set this up at a distance, this is probably a good time to do that and see how everything's playing out. Are you getting that sense of form that you'd like to in the waves? Is it creating a sense of light and shadow? Does it read like waves right now? So I'm sorry that we're dang it, having some tech issues. I think we're back. Okay. Barb is asking if it's possible to flunk this class. Absolutely not. This isn't a class. This is drawing together. This is all of us getting together to draw and kind of share our experiences. I have issues with grades and finding their value, especially in art, because I feel like it's all about improvement. So what I'm doing here is I'm working the values. I'm feeling like I've got these 3 marks that are very consistent. They're generally the same shape, size, they're evenly spaced, and they're about the same value. So I want to address that a little bit. And actually what I think this, I just need to kind of soften a little bit, and I think there needs to be more kind of light up on this area where that light is reflecting. And then kind of come down in here, maybe add a little bit of depth into this value in here. I'm not quite getting the scale of these quite right. It's not exactly the way that looks in this area, but I like the way it reads. It's reading as that a bit of that ground being exposed to just that thin layer of water like glass on top of it. And that's ultimately what I want to achieve, but it's not exactly the way I'm observing it in the photo. But I feel like that provides a little bit of structure over there. And let me see. Using the kneaded eraser to pull out some of the lights in these areas. This whole area I think could go darker. So I'll put a wash over on top of this. And then gradually gets lighter up in this area. All right, that reads a little bit better now. That helps to pull that forward. All right, so hopefully it seems like there's been some technical difficulties. Let's see, are we back? Is everybody back? I know it looked like it bogged down for a little bit, but it looks like it's back now. Okay. All right, so now I want to move down here, and again, I want to finish this and then come back right into the very end with some of that ocean spray there. Just like I did back here, this is going to be less detailed. This is going to be a little bit less detailed as well, trying to create a depth of field, and then I'm going to add more kind of sharpness in that front area. So the question I'm asking myself is how do I do that? Let's see. So I'm seeing some of the rocks through that layer of kind of glassy water. And I'm just looking for the shapes of the dark. And you can see how I'm holding the pencil. Again, looking at the flow of the water, trying to observe any sort of structure of light and dark, adding some variation in there. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just trying to focus a little bit more. So we can move this along. Right in here. This is really fascinating to see what's happening with that wave that's cresting, and it almost like it kind of crinkles, which is kind of interesting. So it's a different type of mark. And again, just like in some of these other areas, it's not necessarily trying to match that mark exactly. It's trying to observe what is the fundamental nature of that mark in that area, and try to capture that. You know, so there's some areas where those marks are long and smooth and thin, and these areas are, in this area is just a little bit different. And so I'm going to change up the way that my pencil moves. And that's the nature of kind of gesture drawing, is you're reacting to that structure. And if you've got something that's sharp and hard, you make sharp and hard marks. If you have something that's soft or fluid, you try to make marks that are soft and fluid. Hopefully that makes sense. And so with this grip, the way I'm holding it, you can see that I can move quickly from being kind of more broad with my marks, and then right in I can just roll up and then add kind of a sharper edge. So play around with how you hold the pencil to give you the marks that you need. And I'm going to just kind of suggest this. I'm just going to be looking for the areas of lighter and darker areas here, without trying to get bogged down too much in details. So hopefully it suggests that form, and it provides enough of a structure that we don't question it, but not so much detail that it draws our eye. Instead, we wanted to go right there. And then right in here we have that white seafoam kind of breaking, and now we have these rocks, very different textures, so I want different marks in this area. I can use the texture of the paper there to reinforce the texture of the rock as well. And then maybe smooth it out using the shading stump in this area to create some of that contrast between the texture and then come some of that smoother stuff. All right, so as we kind of work our way across, again, we want to be thinking about that structure. We're shearing across this plane, and it gradually starts to increase its angle. So that changes the shapes. They become more open. As we move up, we can just see more of them. Put a wash down there, darken that up a little bit. Put another wash over here. Just try to capture, again, there's some reflected light that's bouncing off the waves there. But we want to make sure that that's not as bright as those highlights. How are we doing on time? About an hour and a quarter, probably got about 15 minutes left or so of this. Pretty typical for a drawing together episode is to be about an hour and a half or so. Some of them go a little bit longer. I'm glad to hear you say that, Wilma, about the direction of the marks. It's such an important thing, and it's not something that I really gave much attention to until I was, really had spent more time with it. One of the things that's helpful right in here is I got this bar right under here that my hand is resting on. That helps me to create kind of, it's a little bit more stable, but keeps my hand off the page. Some people use what's called a maul stick, which is a piece of wood that you might lean over here, and then your arm kind of rests on it like this. I don't use them, and just because it has just not something I've done. So, all right, I feel more confident about this. I like what's happening down in here. I think I want to kind of knock this down in value a little bit. So that's, again, I want to keep the brightest whites right in here. Now I need to work on that sea spray, and that's really going to be achieved through a lot of negative drawing. Now I do have a white chalk or charcoal pencil that I could, use, but when I tried it on my preparatory one, it didn't work out very well. It just kind of was gray and dull, and I'm not sure if it really added much to it. And now one of the things I want to do is kind of put myself in that moment and recognize that if I was standing at the beach, I would not be able to see this level of detail. The camera has frozen it for me, and but I wouldn't be able to see this level of detail and refinement. So I want to try to be mindful of that and allow myself to not necessarily get carried away by drawing each and every little droplet of that spray. So I'm just kind of tapping along as I go, trying to work on that negative space. We're creating that white by drawing the shape of the darks around it. And if we pull in some areas into focus and let other areas be kind of soft, it'll help to suggest that spray more than anything. I can come in here with a shading stump and do the same thing. And think about keeping your marks irregular. Again, watch out for patterns that might be forming in your mark making. So as we come up here, there's a shadow in here. So your mind needs to be on two things at once. You're making those dark marks, but the intent of those dark marks is to create that negative drawing to show that sea spray, right? So that it can be tricky to do that, but you want to be looking at what's left on the page, the white part of the page. Is it reading like that sea spray? Let's see if I'm just really kind of focusing on changing the marks in that area, the mind is more likely to accept it as that sea spray, because it's a different type of mark than what we're seeing in other parts. Let's see, I kind of darken this a little bit. I want to be thinking about where the lightest parts of that sea spray are and isolate those. So as we come across here, now this kind of rolls in here. I'm trying to see the larger mass of that white sea foam, and then as I work through, try to see some of the finer areas. I'm rolling the material in my fingers to try to create more irregular marks and access new areas of charcoal. And that's where the material really starts to do its own thing. Just kind of let it skip across the page. All right, so that's feeling a little bit better. Again, it's not exactly one-to-one, but hopefully it captures that overall flow of that wave. There's a little bit of light that catches up in here that I want to kind of capture, and just tapping with the kneaded eraser here kind of create some variation. And then kind of erasing across the crest of it, hopefully will give it more of that undulation that we're looking for. And then right in here, I feel like it becomes more visible, and I can darken in that shape right around in here, sharpen up that edge. And this is where, you know, we can start to use line in some areas. So if we want to, say, draw attention to this area, I can draw kind of a darker line right up in here. But I want to be sensitive to that. I don't want that line to be hard and consistent as I follow along the crest of the wave here. I just needed in a few areas to pop that out and give it a little bit more definition, perhaps a bit more expression. Right in there, that helps to bring that forward. And right in here, I can drop in a line right in here. Hopefully pull out some of that sea spray there. All right, so now we just need to move on. What we did here, we need to do in this part of the wave here. Same type of thinking that we've got going on. Be thinking about the structure of the wave, looking for the areas of dark, kind of negative space in there. There's a bit of a shadow right in here as this curls over. That's kind of cool. And again, I'm not trying to match the drawing, the photograph one-to-one. I'm trying to, I'm looking at that region and trying to ask myself, what's the general shape of that mark in that region? And then go from there. I'm glad to hear it. Thank you all for the positive comments. And I'm glad, that comment right there, OBB, is even more alive in the drawing than the photo. That's, again, that's kind of what we're going for. Like this, if I'm training myself to be in a position where I could go to the ocean and draw from life, I would not be able to freeze a wave like this camera has done. And so I want to be able to understand the structure of that. And what you'd be doing is, like, a wave would be coming in. And if I was here for 2 hours, going to be 100 waves coming in. And each one is going to be its own, but similar at the same time. And so you observe one wave after the next, and then your finished drawing or your finished painting becomes kind of a combination of all of those waves. It's kind of like, I had heard that Rodin, the sculptor, when he would create his statues that are in motion, would take, each body part would be kind of at a different point in that process of, say, walking. So it wouldn't necessarily be a frozen moment as much as, the arm might be, taken from one part of a step, the other arm might be another part of that step, and there'd be a slight kind of observation of that, and that's what would make it feel so naturalistic, is that, he really understood how the body moved, and it wasn't capturing one specific, frozen body in time, but, different bits and pieces from different parts of the walking process. I hope that's true. That's what I had been taught, and that's the way I perceive them. All right, so now I'm just kind of refining, adding some of these areas, allowing this shading to kind of roll in my fingers as I'm reacting to the shapes in this area of the drawing. But I feel like we're pretty much there. One of the things that I really liking that's happening is right in this area, that edge has been kind of lost. We come down here and it's sharper. We come up here and it's sharper. We move over here and we lose that edge again. So there's this lost and found edge that can be really helpful in capturing something. And I feel like overall this is a bit stronger than my initial attempt. And if I bring that out, here's my initial attempt. It's smaller and it's on that rag paper. And I feel like it was okay, but I feel like this is just stronger. It's a little bit sharper. I feel like it captures the movement energy a little bit more, and there's a bit more contrast in the texture. So, so excellent. I'm going to hang out for just a few more seconds while, if there are any kind of lingering questions, but this is pretty much it. I think we've reached the end of it. So join me every Monday and Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. On Monday, we have Smiles Per Hour, working on another portrait drawing, focusing on capturing a smile. So that's going to be fun. And then we have an owl next Wednesday. So that's also going to be a lot of fun. So again, join me 3 p.m. Eastern. Go to artistnetwork.com. You'll find the links below. If you want to subscribe, you'll be notified when we have new live events. And we're going to be looking at, here at Artist Network, expanding this to more live events. One of our instructors, Johannes, he does these paint-alongs most Saturdays that are very similar to this, but he does painting. He does oil painting, watercolor, pastel. We're also looking at expanding here on our YouTube channel as well, because this has just been a blast, and hoping that we can bring more instructors to you. So thank you so much. If you have any questions, again, I'm going to hang out for just a few more seconds, because it always happens. I'll click end, and then I'll see a question come in that I'm like, oh, I really want to answer that question, and I can't because I've lost it. So this does go up as a recording, so if I did miss a question that you'd like me to answer, post that comment in the video below the recording of that, and I will do my best to answer that there. Also, if you go to Artist Network, you can find the individual show pages where people have been sharing their work and commenting, and that's been really awesome. So again, thank you all for participating in that, and I hope to see more, and hopefully we'll see the drawings of the waves here shortly. Thank you so much. See you all on Monday. Have a tremendous weekend. If you're by the ocean, I hope it's safe for you to go out and enjoy the waves. If not, like me, we'll have to live vicariously through our artwork. So thank you, and I'll see you all on Monday.